The heavy rain drummed relentlessly against the cobbled streets of London as Hercule Poirot stepped out of the cab, his perfectly polished shoes making an almost imperceptible splash in the forming puddles. He adjusted his hat and smoothed the lapels of his immaculate gray suit, his mustache twitching slightly as he surveyed the grand townhouse before him. The residence of Lady Margaret Willoughby was an elegant but aging structure, its once pristine white façade now dulled by time and weather. But it was not architecture that had summoned Poirot here tonight. It was a crime most peculiar. A uniformed constable greeted him at the door, his expression tense beneath the dim glow of the gaslights. "Inspector Japp is waiting for you inside." "Sir," he said, stepping aside. Poirot nodded, stepping over the threshold and into the opulent but eerily silent home. He was immediately struck by the stillness of the place. Despite the presence of several officers, an unspoken heaviness lingered in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. Japp stood near the center of the lavish drawing-room. His broad frame hunched slightly as he examined something on the polished mahogany floor. "Ah, Poirot, glad you could make it," he said gruffly, motioning him over. "This one's a proper puzzle." Poirot stepped closer and tilted his head, taking in the sight before him. A woman lay sprawled across the floor, her lifeless body draped in a deep red evening gown. Her blonde hair was meticulously styled. Her lips painted a striking crimson, and yet her eyes were frozen open in an expression of pure astonishment. A single bullet hole marred the silk fabric just above her heart, but there was no gun in sight. The room itself bore no signs of forced entry, nor was there any immediate indication of struggle. "What do we know of the victim?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but keen. Japp rubbed the back of his neck. "Lady Margaret Willoughby, or so we thought," he said. "She moved to London 5 years ago, claimed to be the widow of some wealthy gentleman from Yorkshire. Kept mostly to herself, but she had a bit of a reputation in social circles, charitable events, dinner parties, that sort of thing. Quite a few acquaintances, but no close friends." He gestured toward the ornate fireplace, where a single sheet of paper lay on the mantelpiece. "And here's where it gets strange." Poirot retrieved the paper, unfolding it with deliberate care. It was a marriage certificate, or rather, it should have been. Instead, it was nothing but a blank form. The spaces where names and dates should have been were conspicuously empty. Poirot's sharp gaze flicked back to the body. "Curious," he murmured. "You say she was known as Lady Margaret Willoughby, a widow?" Japp nodded. "That's right, yet this document suggests no marriage at all." Poirot's voice was contemplative, his mind already spinning possibilities. Why would a woman claim a title that does not belong to her? "Exactly what I was wondering," Japp admitted. "Whoever she really was, she wasn't a widow." Poirot's eyes narrowed, scanning the rest of the room. He noticed something else, a small, overturned crystal glass near the victim's hand. A single drop of amber liquid clung to the rim, yet no bottle or decanter was in sight. Strange. A woman dressed for the evening, alone in her home, sipping what might have been her last drink. Or had she been with someone? Poirot turned his attention to the windows. They were all locked from the inside, and the door to the drawing-room had been closed when officers arrived. If someone had killed her, They had done so in an instant and vanished into thin air. Japp sighed. We searched the house top to bottom. No murder weapon, no sign of forced entry. No one saw anyone come or go. If you ask me, this one's impossible. Poirot smiled faintly. Impossible. Ah, mon ami, you wound me. The impossible merely requires more delicate unraveling. His fingers traced the edge of the blank certificate, his mind forming the first tendrils of understanding. Whoever she had been in life, this woman had built her existence upon a carefully constructed deception. And now, in death, she had left. Behind a mystery that defied explanation, Poirot straightened, his keen eyes glinting with interest. Come, Japp, let us see if the dead can speak. Poirot moved with measured precision, stepping lightly around the crime scene as Japp watched him with a mix of impatience and reluctant admiration. The inspector knew that Poirot's methods were often unorthodox, but he had also learned never to dismiss the little Belgian's observations, no matter how trivial they seemed at first. Poirot's fingers danced over the lace-trimmed edges of a nearby armchair, tracing a pattern in the dust. He paused, frowning slightly. This chair, mon ami, he murmured. Does it not strike you as odd? Japp gave it a passing glance. What about it? It's an old chair. Probably hasn't been moved in years. Poirot shook his head. And yet, there is no dust along. The armrests not like the surrounding furniture. Someone sat here recently. He gestured toward the nearby table, where a porcelain saucer lay abandoned. The cup it once held was missing, and it seems they were served tea. But where is the cup, I wonder? Japp exhaled sharply. You think she had a visitor? Non, I do not think I observe. Poirot's gaze returned to the body. She was expecting someone, that much is clear. But did she know them? That is the question. He tapped a finger to his lips, then turned abruptly to one of the constables standing near the door. Pardon, but who was first on the scene? The officer stiffened. That would be me, sir. Name's Sergeant Atkins. Tell me, mon cher. Sergeant Atkins, when you arrived, was the door locked? At first, yes, Atkins confirmed. We had to break it in, but there weren't any bolts fastened from the inside, and the key was missing. Missing, Poirot repeated, his mustache twitching slightly. Now that is very interesting. Japp folded his arms. Could mean the killer took it, or, Poirot countered smoothly, it could mean our victim opened the door herself, locking it afterward, which would suggest she believed herself. To be alone, Japp frowned. But that'd mean what? The murderer was already inside? Poirot didn't answer immediately. He took another slow step around the room, eyes flickering across every surface. He examined the fireplace, the grand bookshelves, the gilded mirror hanging above the mantel. Then, suddenly, his gaze settled on something small and unassuming in the farthest corner of the room. A shoe, but not the victim's. Poirot crouched gracefully and plucked it from its resting place, a delicate heeled slipper, clearly meant for a woman, but curiously mismatched with the deep red gown Lady Margaret Willoughby wore. Poirot turned it over in his hands, his eyes narrowing at a faint scuff along the sole. He muttered something in French under his breath. Japp stepped closer. Well, Poirot held the shoe up. It does not belong to the victim. Look her own shoes are still upon her feet, perfectly fastened. And yet, here we have a single slipper, abandoned as though its owner left in a hurry. Japp scratched his head. Could belong to a servant, maybe? Oh, but a servant would wear something practical, non? This, my dear Japp, is the shoe of a woman accustomed to elegance. And yet, it does not match the dress of our deceased. A second woman was here tonight. Japp's expression darkened. You think there was a struggle? Poirot examined the room again, then shook his head. No, there are no signs of a fight. No disturbance except for this one curious detail. He looked toward Sergeant Atkins. Were any other rooms searched? At first glance, yes, Atkins said. But we've yet to go through them thoroughly. Poirot rose, placing the slipper carefully on the edge of the table. Then I believe it is time we did so. But first tell me, Inspector, who was it that discovered the body? Japp checked his notebook. Her maid, Elsie Carter. Arrived this evening, found the door locked, and after no answer, she alerted the neighbors. Ah, Poirot murmured. Then I should very much like to speak with Mademoiselle Carter. Japp signaled to a nearby officer, who quickly left the room. Moments later, the maid was brought in, an anxious young woman with red-rimmed eyes and a white-knuckled grip on the handkerchief she clutched to her chest. She curtsied awkwardly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Yes, sir, I already told the other officers everything I know." Poirot gave her a gentle smile. "Mademoiselle, I assure you, we seek only clarity. You are devoted to your mistress, non?" Elsie nodded quickly. "Why, yes, sir. She was very kind to me, and tell me, did Lady Margaret have visitors often?" "Not often," Elsie admitted, fidgeting. "She was selective with who she let into her home." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "But she did have a visitor tonight." Elsie hesitated, glancing toward Japp, then back to Poirot. I don't know," she said quickly. "I wasn't here, but you suspect someone." Poirot pressed gently. "Perhaps you saw something before you left? A sign, a message?" Elsie bit her lip. "No, well," she hesitated. "There was something odd. Before I left for the evening, I saw Lady Margaret writing a letter. She seemed troubled." "A letter?" Japp asked. "Where is it now?" Elsie shook her head. "I don't know. I never saw it again." Poirot exchanged a glance with Japp before turning back to Elsie. "And did she mention anything else? Perhaps a name?" Elsie hesitated for a long moment. Then, in a near whisper, she said, "She mentioned a woman." A name I'd never heard her say before. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And that name was?" Elsie swallowed hard. "Beatrice." The name hung in the air like an echo, and Poirot's mind whirred with possibilities. A mysterious visitor, a missing key, a misplaced shoe, and now the name of a woman who, until now, had no known connection to Lady Margaret Willoughby. Poirot straightened his cuffs, his mind already leaping ahead. "Come, Japp. I believe we must find Beatrice. Poirot tapped a finger against his lips, his mind carefully arranging the emerging pieces of the puzzle. A missing letter, a misplaced slipper, a name whispered in fear Beatrice. The case was taking shape, but as always, the truth remained veiled beneath a layer of carefully constructed deception. And so, there was only one course of action: to peel back those layers, one by one. Japp, already sensing Poirot's intent, wasted no time in organizing a round of questioning. The household staff had been gathered in the parlor, their faces drawn with apprehension as they waited. Poirot entered the room with his usual grace, his gaze sweeping over each person in turn before he settled into a chair. Smoothing his sleeves, "Mes amis," he said pleasantly, "let us talk." The first to be questioned was Elsie Carter, the maid, who had already proven herself a nervous but seemingly sincere witness. She sat perched on the edge of her seat, twisting her handkerchief between pale fingers. "I've told you everything." "I know," she insisted. "Lady Margaret was upset about something, but she didn't confide in me. I only overheard the name." Poirot studied her for a moment. "And in all the years you served her, you never once heard of this Beatrice before?" Elsie shook her head vehemently. "No, sir." "Never," Japp grunted. "That's strange, considering how much effort the lady went through to keep her past a secret. You'd think she'd have hidden this Beatrice away, too." Poirot only smiled, but there was something knowing in his eyes. "Tell me, Elsie, did your mistress have any visitors in the days before her death?" Elsie hesitated, then nodded. "There was a man. He came late one evening last week. I wasn't supposed to see him, but I did." She lowered her voice, as if afraid of being overheard. "He was tall, dark-haired, handsome in a way," but she shuddered. "There was something about him that frightened me. Did you hear a name?" Japp asked. "No," Elsie admitted. "But Lady Margaret was very quiet after he left. She stayed up all night." Poirot exchanged a glance with Japp. A mysterious man, a secret letter, and now a name: the unseen Beatrice. The puzzle grew more intriguing with each turn. Next came Mrs. Boyle, the housekeeper, a stout woman with a face like a clenched fist. She sat with her arms folded tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I already told the other officers I don't know nothing about no Beatrice." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Then let us not speak of Beatrice, madam. Let us speak instead of Lady Margaret. How long did you serve her?" 3 years, Mrs. Boyle said curtly. "Kept the house running. Never asked questions." Poirot nodded, seemingly satisfied. "And in those 3 years, did she ever seem afraid?" Mrs. Boyle hesitated a fraction of a second too long. "No." Poirot smiled. "Ah, but you are." "Lying, madam?" Mrs. Boyle bristled. "I am not." Poirot steepled his fingers. "It is not a crime to withhold the truth, but it does suggest you are protecting something or someone. Tell me, who are you protecting?" Mrs. Boyle's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you mean." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Then let me ask another question. Why was a slipper belonging to someone other than Lady Margaret found in the drawing room?" Japp, who had been scribbling notes, looked up in surprise. "You know whose it is?" Poirot nodded. "But of course. It belongs to someone who left in great haste, perhaps even before the crime was discovered, Mrs." Boyle's face paled. "I don't know." Poirot lifted a hand. "Madam, you are a woman of great loyalty. I do not believe you are involved in this crime, but I do believe you are protecting someone. Tell me, was Beatrice here that night?" Mrs. Boyle's breath hitched. The silence stretched, and then at last she spoke. "I don't know her name," she admitted, "but there was another woman here. She came in secret through the servants. Entrance. I told her she had no business here, but she wouldn't leave." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "Describe her." "She was younger than Lady Margaret," Mrs. Boyle muttered. "Dark-haired, well-dressed. But she looked desperate." Jap leaned forward. "Desperate how?" Mrs. Boyle rubbed at her temple, as though regretting every word. "Like she was afraid of something. Or someone." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Did Lady Margaret let her in?" Mrs. Boyle nodded reluctantly. "Yes." They argued, not shouting, but tense. "I didn't hear what was said. The woman left in a hurry. And that's all I know." Poirot leaned back, considering. "A woman fearful. A man ominous. And Lady Margaret caught in between." The shape of the mystery grew clearer. But the truth still lurked just beyond reach. Jap exhaled sharply. "So, we've got a mysterious visitor and a frightened victim, but no murder weapon and no solid suspect." Poirot nodded slowly. "Not yet, mon ami. But we are close." Jap scratched his chin. "Then what's next?" Poirot's mustache twitched as he smiled. "We find the woman called Beatrice, and we ask her what truly happened that night." Poirot sat in quiet contemplation, fingers steepled as his mind wove together the strands of the mystery. A dead woman, a vanished key, a misplaced slipper, and a name spoken in fear: Beatrice. The case had begun to take shape, but the true motive remained elusive, tangled in deception and half-truths. Every suspect had something to hide, but which of them had reason enough to kill? Jap paced the room, his frustration growing. "Right, let's lay it out plain. We've got a woman, Beatrice, who comes here in secret. We've got a mysterious man visiting a week prior, leaving Lady Margaret shaken. And we've got a household full of people who claim to know nothing. Yet someone killed her," he gestured toward Poirot. "So what now? We track down Beatrice?" Poirot inclined his head. "Oh, yes, mon ami. But before we do, we must understand something very important." He tapped his temple. "The motive. It is the key that unlocks all else." Jap grumbled. "Well, we don't have one." Poirot smiled. "Oh, but we do. We simply do not yet see it clearly." Jap folded his arms. "All right, let's hear it then." Poirot stood and began to pace in his small, deliberate steps. "Consider. Lady Margaret was not a woman who attracted scandal. She lived a quiet life, her affairs carefully guarded. Yet something or someone had shaken her enough to warrant secrecy. The missing letter, the late-night visitor, the name Beatrice whispered in fear. There is a secret here, mon ami. A secret worth killing for, Japp sighed. So where do we start? Poirot's gaze sharpened. With the ones who claim to know. The least, Elsie Carter was brought in once more, her fingers still twisting that same handkerchief, her eyes darting between Poirot and Japp. Poirot watched her carefully. Mademoiselle, you are fond of your mistress, non? Yes, sir. And yet, Poirot continued, you are quick to tell us how little you knew, as though you feared speaking too much. Elsie stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Poirot's voice remained gentle. Mademoiselle, you told us of a visitor, a man. You saw him, yes? Elsie nodded hesitantly. And you feared him. She swallowed hard, lowering her gaze. He had a dangerous air about him. Poirot nodded. And yet, you never mentioned the other visitor. The woman, Elsie's head snapped up. I what? Poirot's smile did not waver. Mademoiselle, you are observant enough too. Notice the man. Would you have truly failed to notice a woman entering in secret, especially one who left so suddenly that she abandoned her own shoe? Elsie's lips parted, but she hesitated. Poirot leaned forward. You did see her. Elsie's hands tightened. Around her handkerchief. She exhaled shakily. I did. I saw her leaving that night, rushing out through the back entrance. Poirot nodded. And did she see you? Elsie hesitated. No, I don't think so. Describe her. Elsie fidgeted. Dark-haired. Beautiful. But she looked scared. She was muttering to herself, something about too late, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, like she was afraid of being followed. Poirot exchanged a glance with Japp. And yet, you said nothing of this before. I was scared. Elsie's voice rose. I thought if I said anything, I might get in trouble. I didn't know who she was, and Lady Margaret never spoke of her. I didn't think it mattered. Oh, but it matters very much. Mademoiselle? Poirot studied her. Tell me, did Lady Margaret receive any correspondence before her death? Letters, perhaps? Elsie bit her lip, then nodded. Yes. A letter arrived just 2 days ago. She read it alone in her study, then burned it in the fireplace. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Burned it. And you are certain it was completely destroyed? Elsie nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I saw the ashes myself. Poirot exhaled. A pity. A letter burned suggests something to hide. And yet, the lady did not destroy all traces of it, because she wrote one in return. One that has now vanished. Japp rubbed his temples. So we've got this Beatrice woman sneaking in, a letter that's disappeared, and a dead woman. But how does the man from last week fit into this? Poirot turned to Elsie once more. Did Lady Margaret say anything about her visitor from last week? Did she seem pleased to see him? Elsie hesitated, then shook her head. No, if anything, she seemed resigned, like she knew he would come, and she didn't like it. Poirot's mind word. And what did she say after he left? Elsie swallowed. She said, I hoped I would never have to see him again. A hush fell over the room. Poirot sat back, a flicker of something sharp in his eyes. "Ah, that is very revealing," Japp frowned. "How so?" Poirot stood, straightening his cuffs. "Because it tells us two things. First, this man was not a stranger to Lady Margaret. And second," he paused, his mustache twitching, "she was afraid of him." Japp exhaled. "Which means he had." "Motive," Poirot nodded. "And so did Beatrice." Japp ran a hand through his hair. "Which one do you think did it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Oh, mon ami, that is the wrong question. The real question is who else had something to gain." The following morning, Inspector Japp arrived at the estate with a triumphant air, his usual skepticism momentarily replaced by satisfaction. In his hand, he held a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn and the pages within slightly crinkled as if they had been thumbed through in haste. Poirot, seated in a high-backed chair by the fireplace, merely arched a brow at the inspector's enthusiasm. "Got him," Japp declared, slapping the journal onto the table with the certainty of a man convinced he had cracked the case. "We found this in Lady Margaret's study, tucked away behind some old ledgers. Belonged to our missing Lady Beatrice." Poirot leaned forward with interest, but did not reach for the book. "And what does this journal reveal, mon ami?" Japp flipped. It opened, tapping a particular passage with a firm finger. "Confirms everything we suspected. Beatrice wasn't just some acquaintance, she was Margaret's sister." A sharp silence settled over the room. Poirot's gaze remained impassive, though his fingers twitched ever so slightly. "Ah," he murmured, "and this, you believe, explains the crime?" "More than that," Japp went on, flipping further into the journal. "Looks like the two of them were caught in some kind of dispute. Beatrice claims in her writing that Lady Margaret owed her something money, perhaps an inheritance, and not just a little. She writes about what was stolen from me and how she deserved what was rightfully mine." Japp turned the book around, showing Poirot the passage. "I think it's clear, don't you? She confronted Margaret that night. An argument broke out, and things got out of hand." Poirot did not reach for the journal. His head tilted slightly, his gaze sharp. "And yet," he said softly, "Lady Margaret was found seated in her chair, untouched, but for the marks of strangulation. There was no sign of a struggle." Japp's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, but he was undeterred. Maybe Margaret didn't fight back. Maybe she trusted her sister and never saw it coming. Poirot merely stared at him, his fingers drumming idly against the arm of his chair. "And the missing letter?" he prompted. Japp hesitated. "Not found yet. But with this," he gestured to the journal, "we don't need it. Beatrice had the most reason to kill Margaret. We've got her motive, and she fled the scene. That's more than enough to bring her in." Poirot exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Ah, mon ami, you are so quick to declare victory. But you—" "See," he gestured toward the journal. "This is too neat, too convenient." Japp's jaw tensed. "How do you mean?" Poirot reached for the book at last, turning the pages carefully. A journal, hidden just enough to be found. A confession, Not quite explicit, but enough to imply guilt. And Beatrice, conveniently missing, his eyes lifted. "Tell me who found this." "One of the constables," Japp replied. "In the back of the study, near the fireplace." "Where the other letter was burned." Japp exhaled. "Now see here, Poirot, you can't argue with what's written in that book." Poirot smiled faintly. "Oh, but I can question why it was found so conveniently." He closed the journal with a decisive snap. And why, if Beatrice were indeed the murderer, she would leave behind such an incriminating piece of evidence. Japp's confidence wavered, but he remained stubborn. "It's possible she didn't have time to destroy it." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Possible, yes, but not likely." He stood, adjusting his cuffs with methodical precision. "Tell me, Japp, if you were to frame a person for murder, how would you go about it?" Japp's expression darkened. "You're saying someone planted this?" "I am saying," Poirot corrected, "that Beatrice is not our killer. And whoever is, they are very much still among us." Japp rubbed a hand over his face. "So you're telling me we don't have our murderer?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "No, mon ami. I am telling you we have only just begun." Poirot sat in deep thought, his fingers resting lightly against his lips as he turned the journal's pages with deliberate care. The weight of the crime no longer rested solely in the present. It stretched backward into the past, where the true motives lay buried. Japp, still standing near the fireplace, watched with a frown of impatience. "I don't see what more you're expecting to find," he muttered. "The woman's words are there, plain as day. She believed Lady Margaret had wronged her, and now Lady Margaret is dead." Poirot didn't respond immediately. His fingers brushed against a page where the ink seemed slightly darker than the rest, as if the writer had pressed down too hard, emotions spilling onto the paper. He read aloud, his voice smooth and thoughtful. "She will never acknowledge the truth. She never has. But I will have my due, whether she gives it willingly or not." Poirot lifted his gaze. "And yet, mon ami, what is it that Lady Margaret never acknowledged?" Japp sighed. "That Beatrice was her sister." "Seems obvious enough." Poirot shook his head. Non. It is too obvious. The true crime is never about what is stated outright. It is about what is left unsaid." He tapped the journal. "Beatrice does not demand money outright. She does not mention an inheritance. She speaks only of truth." Japp exhaled. "Then what truth was she after?" Poirot stood, moving toward the writing desk where Lady Margaret had once sat, her secrets sealed within this very room. His gaze swept across the surface, then toward the bookshelves. He trailed a finger along the edges of the books until he stopped at a small, nondescript volume tucked near the end. He pulled it free. A family history, its spine cracked with age. "Tell me, Japp, when did Lady Margaret's father die?" Japp frowned. "Must be over 30 years ago." "Why?" Poirot flipped through the book's yellowed pages, his eyes scanning names and dates. Then he found it Lord Albert Cavendish, deceased 1896. His widow, Lady Eleanor, had lived on for many years after. But something else caught Poirot's attention, a child, not two daughters, as the records publicly stated. 3. Japp leaned in. Wait, Margaret, Beatrice, and he blinked at the name. And Cavendish. Poirot's mustache twitched. Beatrice was not Lady Margaret's only forgotten sister. Japp's expression darkened as he studied the page. And Cavendish. I've never heard of her, nor had I, Poirot admitted. And yet, here she is recorded, then erased. No mention of her in recent years. No trace of her in society. As if she simply vanished. Japp scratched his head. Maybe she died young? Poirot closed the book gently. Or perhaps moan. Me, she did not vanish at all. Japp exhaled sharply. You think she changed her name? Poirot's eyes gleamed. I think that if we find in Cavendish, we find our murderer. The realization sent a chill through the air. A sister wiped from history. A name no one spoke. And now, a dead woman who had once lived in fear. The past had clawed its way back into the present. Dragging its secrets with it, Poirot turned to Japp, his expression unreadable. Summon the household. There is someone among them who knows the truth. The air inside Cavendish Manor felt heavier as the household gathered once more in the drawing-room. The tension had grown thick and unspoken, like a storm pressing. Against the windows, every person in the room had been touched by the murder in some way, but Poirot knew one among them had been touched by it before it even occurred. The crime had its roots in the past, and now it was time to shake those roots loose. He stood at the center, surveying the faces before him. Inspector Japp remained near the fireplace, arms crossed, his expression guarded. Miss Harrington, lady, Margaret's lifelong companion, sat stiff-backed on the edge of a chair. Dr. Lysander, the estate physician, adjusted his glasses with nervous fingers. Young Edward, the nephew, leaned against the far wall, his face a mask of impassivity. And there was Mrs. Endicott, the housekeeper, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap, her eyes darting between them all. Poirot cleared his throat, and all eyes turned to him. There is a saying, he began, his voice measured, that the past is never truly buried. It waits beneath the surface, quiet and still, until someone dares to uncover it. And now, mes amis, we must uncover it. His gaze flickered over them, reading each face, noting the subtle shifts in breath, in posture, in the minute twitches of fingers. We have spoken much of Lady Margaret's hidden sister, Beatrice, but we have not spoken of the other sister, the one who vanished. And Cavendish, a slight, almost imperceptible reaction, a tightening of Dr. Lysander's jaw, a quick intake of breath from Miss Harrington. Young Edward blinked, his expression carefully blank. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. Now I am but a humble detective. I do not claim to be a magician, none. But I do believe in the power of a name. He let the silence settle, then continued, his tone soft but deliberate. So I propose a little experiment, a game, if you will. I shall say the name once more, and we shall see who among us feels its weight. His voice dropped to a whisper, and Cavendish. The reaction was subtle, but it was there. Dr. Lysander's fingers clenched slightly. Miss Harrington's throat bobbed as she swallowed. But it was Mrs. Endicott who betrayed the first crack. Her breath hitched a shallow, quick intake, as if she had been struck by something unseen. Her eyes flickered downward, hands pressing harder into her lap. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Madam," he said gently, stepping toward her, "you knew her, did you not?" The old housekeeper hesitated. Poirot nodded encouragingly. "It is difficult, n'est ce pas, to keep a secret buried for so long, but it always finds a way to rise, Mrs." Endicott's lips trembled. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Poirot tilted his head. "Then let us try another test, Let us not use words. Let us use the face." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, aged photograph. Japp leaned in slightly, frowning. "Where'd you get that?" "The family records," Poirot said simply. "The Cavendish archives are extensive." This was tucked among them, forgotten. He held it up so they could all see. The image was faded, but the three girls were unmistakable Lady Margaret, young and composed. Beatrice, slightly behind her, her expression unreadable. And between them, a third girl, her hair slightly wild, her eyes sharp and watchful. Anne. Cavendish Poirot held the photograph before Mrs. Endicott. "Look at her, madam. Look at her, and tell me where did she go?" The housekeeper stared at it, her breathing uneven. Her lips pressed together tightly, and for a moment it seemed she would say nothing at all. But then she didn't vanish. She whispered. A hush fell over the room. Poirot's expression did not change, but there was something knowing in his eyes. "None, Mrs." Endicott shook her head, her voice barely above a breath. "She changed her name." Poirot nodded slowly, as if this only confirmed what he had suspected. "And what name did she take, madam?" The housekeeper looked down, wringing her hands, and then, finally, the truth slipped free. Miss Harrington, a gasp. Every head turned toward the woman in question. Miss Harrington's face had gone utterly pale. Her fingers clenched at the arms of her chair. Poirot stepped closer, studying her with quiet intensity. "And Cavendish," he murmured, "or should. I say, Miss Harrington?" She did not deny it, but her silence spoke louder than words. Japp swore under his breath. "Bloody hell," Poirot nodded. "The past has returned, madam. And now, you must tell us, why did you kill Lady Margaret?" "Miss Harrington." Anne closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, they were sharp and gleaming, just like in the photograph. But now they held something else, something bitter. "She took everything from me," she whispered. "And she thought I would stay forgotten forever." The truth had surfaced at last. Poirot studied Miss Harrington, or rather, and Cavendish, as the weight of her confession settled over the room. She had admitted to feeling wronged, to believing Lady Margaret had taken everything from her, but she had not yet confessed to murder. And Poirot knew better than to assume. Before he could press further, Inspector Japp turned on his heel. "Well, that settles it," he muttered. "We've got the missing sister, we've got motive, and we've got His words trailed off as he suddenly stiffened. His gaze flicked toward the small bureau by the fireplace, where Poirot had placed the damning photograph only moments ago. It was gone, blasted, Japp cursed, patting down his coat as if the photo might have slipped into his own pocket by accident. It was just there. Every eye in the room darted around in frantic search. The polished wood of the bureau remained undisturbed, no sign of the old photograph, no fluttering scrap of forgotten paper. A slow, creeping realization settled over them all. Someone had taken it. Poirot's face remained calm, but his mind sharpened with precision. A crucial moment, this. The past had finally been unearthed, only for its proof to be snatched away in an instant. "How interesting," he murmured. "It seems our mystery is not yet over, Mrs." Endicott's hands trembled in her lap. Edward's fingers twitched by his side, his jaw tight. Dr. Lysander adjusted his glasses with unnecessary force. And Miss Harrington, Anne sat perfectly still, watching, waiting. Japp's eyes narrowed. "Who took it?" Poirot held up a hand. "Ah, mon ami, the better question is why." A silence hung in the air, thick with unease. Poirot turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over them. "The photograph alone, it proves nothing of the murder," he said. "It only reveals a hidden past, a buried truth. So then, we must ask, who among us feared its existence? Who needed it gone?" The flames in the fireplace flickered, casting shifting shadows against the walls. It was here, untouched. Just before Miss Cavendish, he gave a slight nod toward Anne, spoke her truth. And now, mere moments later, it has vanished. Someone among us moved swiftly, with careful hands. Japp exhaled sharply. Whoever it was won't have had time to get rid of it yet. He stepped forward. "Turn out your pockets. All of you, Doctor." Lysander bristled. "Inspector, surely," I said now. Japp snapped. Reluctantly, they obeyed. Mrs. Endicott's trembling fingers pulled free a lace-trimmed handkerchief. Edward produced a crumpled letter. Dr. Lysander, his expression pinched, withdrew a small notebook, a fountain pen, and a half-empty box of matches. Miss Harrington's hands remained still on her lap. "And you, madam?" Poirot asked gently. She did not answer at first. Then slowly she reached into her coat pocket, but her fingers emerged empty. "Nothing," she murmured. "I have nothing." Japp ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Damn it. Then where is it?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A fascinating predicament, n'est-ce pas?" He turned toward the others. "And yet, my friends, we must not let this trick of the hands distract us from the true game at play." His fingers brushed against his lapel as he began to pace, his mind working through the problem. "A piece of evidence has vanished. But what does this tell us?" His voice dropped lower. "Not that someone wishes only to erase the past, but that someone still fears discovery. The truth is not yet fully revealed. And our murderer, they remain in this room." Japp exhaled. "So we have a thief and a killer in our midst. Grand." Poirot's lips curled slightly. "Ah, but perhaps, mon ami, they are one and the same. Japp frowned. You think the murderer took it? Poirot nodded. It is not the photograph itself that is dangerous, but what it represents. His gaze flickered toward Anne. And not merely for her. Someone else stands to lose everything. Edward cleared his throat. Then, what do we do? Poirot tilted his head. We set a trap, natural element. A ripple of tension passed through the room. Poirot continued. Someone believes themselves clever enough to erase the past. But if they are so desperate to conceal the truth, then we must let them believe they have succeeded. And in that moment, when they feel safest, he smiled faintly. We shall watch, and we shall see, and Cavendish met his gaze, her expression. Unreadable. And what if the real evidence disappears before then? Poirot's smile did not waver. Oh, madam, you assume too much. He tapped his temple. A detective, he does not rely on one piece of evidence alone. He keeps many threads in hand, ready to be woven. His eyes flickered toward the fire, where the flames crackled and danced. For the first time, he allowed his gaze to darken slightly. And when the time comes, those who thought themselves unseen shall find the light most blinding. The weight of the vanishing photograph lingered in the air like a specter, an invisible threat, neither seen nor forgotten. Poirot, ever poised, had already set his mental snare, yet the tension in the room was thick with something even he could not name until the scream shattered the silence. It came from the corridor, high-pitched and raw, sending a jolt through everyone in the study. Poirot was the first to move, his small frame unhesitating as he strode toward the door. Japp was only a step behind, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. The others hesitated, frozen in the paralysis of fear. The hallway was dim, flickering light from the sconces casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. Poirot's sharp eyes landed on the figure crumpled near the staircase, a maid, her face stark white, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the door at the end of the corridor. It's Miss Harrington's room. She gasped, her breath hitching. I saw someone. Japp didn't wait for more. He surged forward, Poirot following with measured urgency. The door was ajar, swinging slightly as if someone had just slipped through. Japp pushed it open fully, his revolver raised. But it was clear at a glance no intruder remained inside, but something else had. A body lay slumped across the writing desk, a curtain billowing from the open window beside it. Poirot moved with a precision that seemed almost detached, stepping forward as Japp exhaled sharply. Good Lord! And Cavendish, Miss Harrington, was dead. Her head had tilted unnaturally, strands of her dark hair falling across her cheek. Her lifeless eyes frozen in the final moment of something between horror and surprise. Her hand, limp and motionless, was outstretched as if she had been reaching for something, perhaps someone. A thin ribbon of blood trailed from her temple, staining the white lace sleeve of her blouse. A single heavy object lay beside her wrist. A brass letter opener, smeared with crimson. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his fingertips hovering over the edge of the desk without touching. His eyes were everywhere at once, drinking in every detail. Murder, he said softly, Japp still scanning the corners of the room as if an attacker might spring forth at any moment, let out a slow exhale. "Damn it," he muttered. So, she wasn't the killer after all. Poirot did not respond immediately. He straightened, looking toward the open window. A cold breeze stirred the curtains, but the ground below was far too far for a clean escape. "None," he murmured. "She was not." Japp ran a hand through his hair, his frustration bleeding into his voice. "Which means the real one is still out there. And now they've killed again." Poirot's gaze swept the room once more. Nothing had been taken, not her jewelry, not her papers, not even the expensive perfume bottles aligned neatly on the dresser. This was not a crime of impulse, nor one of desperation. It was a crime of necessity. Someone had silenced her before. She could say too much. There was a sound in the corridor, a shuffle, the hesitant approach of someone unable to stay away. Poirot turned as Edward Endicott appeared in the doorway, his face ashen, his eyes darting wildly over the scene. What happened?" Japp was quick. "Where were you?" Edward swallowed hard. "I was in the study with my mother. We heard the scream." His gaze locked onto Anne's still form, and for a moment something flickered there, something almost like grief. "My God, she's dead?" Poirot watched him keenly. "Oui, monsieur." The young man took a shaky step forward, but then stopped himself, as if the very air around Anne's body was something he could not bear to cross. She wasn't supposed to die." Japp's head snapped toward him. "What did you say?" Edward's mouth opened slightly, as if realizing. Too late, the words that had slipped out. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean, monsieur?" Poirot's voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath it. Edward hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. Then, under the weight of their eyes, he exhaled, shaking his head. "I only meant she wasn't the villain, was she? She had secrets, but she wasn't the one who killed Lady Margaret." Poirot did not answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the body, tilting his head slightly. "Tell me, mon cher Edward, when you entered this room just now, what were you expecting to see?" Edward blinked. "I don't know what you mean." Poirot turned fully to face him. "None? You did not seem surprised." "Not entirely. Shocked, yes, but not surprised." "Why is that?" Edward's hands clenched at his sides. "You're accusing me now?" Japp stepped forward. "Just answer the question." Edward's gaze darted between them, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, he seemed on the edge of something, confession or defiance. Neither was clear. But then, before he could speak, a sound echoed from outside, the sharp crack of a gunshot. Poirot's heart leapt to his throat. Japp's reaction was instant. He was already moving toward the window, his revolver raised as his eyes scanned the darkened grounds below. Poirot moved more slowly, but his mind was racing. A new attack, a new crime. Somewhere out there, in the shadows beyond the grand house, the true villain remained. Not finished. Not yet. Poirot turned from Anne's lifeless form, his mind fitting the pieces together faster than ever before. The game had not ended. It had only just begun. The gunshot rang through the night, sending a ripple of tension through the house. Poirot moved swiftly to the window, his keen eyes scanning the moonlit grounds. Japp was already gripping his revolver, muttering curses under his breath as he strained to see into the darkness beyond the swaying trees. A faint movement caught Poirot's eye, a figure disappearing around the hedge that lined the garden path. "Japp," Poirot said quietly, nodding toward the retreating shadow. Japp didn't need further prompting. He spun on his heel and rushed toward the door, barking orders to the constables stationed downstairs as he tore off toward the garden. Poirot, however, did not follow. He remained by the window, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Edward Endicott had turned pale, his body rigid with something beyond fear, something closer to realization. Poirot observed him carefully before speaking. "You know who it is, don't you?" Edward's mouth opened, but no words came out. Poirot sighed softly. Mademoiselle Harrington knew something. That is why she was killed. And now someone is silencing the last remaining voices who might reveal the truth. Edward swallowed, his gaze darting toward the door as if he were considering flight. Poirot stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "But what you do not realize, mon cher, is that the truth, it does not disappear so easily. No matter how many shots are fired in the night." Edward exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you want me to say." Poirot tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Then perhaps you might tell me what it is you are trying so desperately not to say." A distant shout echoed from the garden's Japp, calling for the constables. Edward flinched. Poirot's gaze did not waver. For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of the wind against the open window. Then, finally, Edward whispered, "I think I've made a terrible mistake." Poirot's expression did not change. "Yes, mon ami. But what kind of mistake?" Edward's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I thought I knew who it was. I thought it was Anne." His voice cracked slightly. "She was hiding something. She was lying. But I don't think she was lying about this." Poirot studied him carefully. "Go on." Edward hesitated. Then his eyes flicked downward to the writing desk where Anne's lifeless hand still rested. "She had a letter," he said. "She told me she had proof. Something about Lady Margaret's will." Poirot's brows lifted ever so slightly. "And where is this letter now?" Edward shook his head. "She wouldn't show it to me. But she said she'd figured out why Lady Margaret changed her will before she died." Poirot tapped a finger against his chin, thoughtful. "Intriguing. And yet she is killed before she can share it." Edward exhaled, a shuddering breath. "I was wrong. I thought," his voice dropped to a near whisper, "I thought Anne was the blackmailer. But maybe she was trying to stop it." Poirot's gaze flickered toward Anne's unmoving form, and then toward the open window once more. "Tell me, mon cher, this letter, who else knew she had it?" Edward's breath hitched. He hesitated. Then almost imperceptibly his eyes flicked toward the hallway. Poirot caught it instantly. He turned sharply toward the door. Footsteps. Light, deliberate. Fading quickly into the distance, Poirot moved with sudden urgency, stepping past Edward and into the corridor. his sharp gaze locking onto the shadow disappearing around the corner at the far end of the hall. Not the killer, perhaps, but someone who knew far too much to be innocent. The pieces were shifting into place now. A will. A blackmailer. A letter that had vanished before it could be read. And above all else, the one detail that had nagged at Poirot from the very beginning. Lady Margaret Cavendish had changed her will before she died, and yet she had no living heirs. Poirot's eyes darkened. A pattern was emerging, and at its center was a lie so carefully constructed that it had almost gone unnoticed. Almost. Poirot moved swiftly down the corridor, his sharp eyes locked on the retreating figure ahead. He did not rush, no, that was not his way. He knew that whoever it was had already revealed more than they intended. A person who eavesdropped at the keyhole was never an innocent bystander. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the marble floors, then abruptly stopped. A door clicked shut. Poirot reached it a moment later and laid his hand lightly on the knob. Locked. But of course, he rapped his knuckles against the wood. Mademoiselle Harrington is dead, monsieur or madam. There is no use in hiding now. Silence. Poirot waited, counting in his head. 1, 2, 3. And then the inevitable shuffle of movement inside. He smiled. There was no true escape from logic. Japp's voice rang out from downstairs, calling to his men. The house was now a flurry of activity. Someone had tried to kill again tonight, but they had failed. And failure breeds desperation. The lock clicked, and the door cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of pale skin and wide, frightened eyes. Eleanor. She was trembling, her hands gripping the door frame so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. I wasn't. Poirot raised a single hand, silencing her. Mademoiselle, a moment ago, you knew something. You were listening. His voice softened just slightly. Tell me what it is you fear. Her breath hitched. I don't know anything, she whispered. None, Poirot said, shaking his head. That is a lie, and you are not very skilled at lying, mademoiselle. Her lips parted, but the words refused to come. Poirot watched as she fought an internal battle, her eyes darting toward the stairs, toward the voices of the police officers below. The choice hung in the air between them. Finally, she exhaled. Shakily. It's not about the will, she said. Not really. Poirot tilted his head. Then what is it about? Eleanor swallowed. It's about Lady Margaret herself. Poirot's brows lifted ever so slightly. Go on, she took. A small, reluctant step back, allowing Poirot to enter the room. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke again. Lady Margaret. She wasn't supposed to be alive. A hush fell between them. Poirot's mind worked quickly, sifting through every detail of the case, every clue he had gathered, every deception that had been carefully spun into this tangled web. She was already dead, Eleanor continued. Years ago. Or at least that's what I was told. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze locked onto hers. Who told you this? Her throat bobbed. My father. A slow realization dawned in Poirot's mind. The false widow. The forged will. The missing heir who never existed. Everything had been built upon a lie. Poirot let out a breath. the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Lady Margaret Cavendish did not change her will before her death. His voice was quiet, steady, because the woman who changed it was not Lady Margaret at all. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, her face ashen. Poirot turned toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back. A woman who was supposed to be dead. A fortune that was meant to be inherited. A will that was rewritten under false pretenses. He turned back to Eleanor, his gaze sharp. And a crime that was never meant to be discovered. She nodded weakly. My father. He helped arrange it. He was paid to keep quiet. But when Anne found out, her voice broke. She was killed for it. Poirot exhaled softly. Yes. And yet, mademoiselle, there is one thing you have not yet told me. He met her eyes. Who is the one pulling the strings? Eleanor's breath trembled. And then, with great effort, she whispered a name, and suddenly the entire case unraveled. Poirot's gaze did not waver as Eleanor whispered the name, her voice barely audible yet carrying the weight of the entire mystery upon it. He had suspected Mays. He had suspected. But confirmation had its own power. He straightened his cuffs, allowing himself a moment before turning toward the door. Come, mademoiselle, he said gently. It is time. Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. You're going to tell them. Poirot gave a small nod. Justice demands it. And you, mademoiselle, have done what is right. That is something too. Hold on to. She swallowed but said no more, following him as he descended the staircase. Below, the house hummed with activity. Japp stood near the fireplace, speaking in low tones to his men, while a few of the remaining guests lingered, watching from a safe distance. The air was thick with tension, but Poirot ignored it. His focus was on one person, and one person alone, seated near the center of the room. Sipping from a delicate porcelain teacup was the woman who had orchestrated everything, Madame Rosewood. She glanced up as Poirot approached, her expression calm, unreadable. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot," she said smoothly, setting the cup down. "Have you come to tell us the case is solved?" Poirot studied her for a moment before nodding. "Yes, madam, I have." The room fell silent. Japp straightened. A few of the guests turned toward them with barely concealed anticipation. Poirot moved closer, his hands gently clasped behind his back. "You have been most clever, madam. Most clever indeed. From the very start, you positioned yourself well close enough to the heart of the matter, yet never quite in the center. You whispered in ears, planted doubts, ensured that the right. People saw what they were meant to see. And all the while, you played the role of the grieving friend." She arched a brow. "That's quite a story, Monsieur Poirot. But I fail to see where I fit in." Poirot smiled. "Oh, but you fit in perfectly. Because you, madam, are not who you claim to be." A murmur spread through the room. Poirot continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "The woman we knew as Lady Margaret Cavendish died years ago. But a new Lady Margaret was created. A woman who could step into her life, claim her fortune, rewrite her will as she pleased." He tilted his head. "A woman who already knew the family well, Who had the means to pull off such a deception? Madame Rosewood's fingers curled slightly against her lap. Poirot's voice did not falter. The real Lady Margaret's body was never found because you, madam, had no need for such an inconvenience. You stepped into her place, forging a new reality. And it would have worked, if only Anne had not discovered the truth. A sharp inhale came from someone in the room. Poirot pressed on. You killed her because she threatened to expose the one thing that could destroy you. And tonight, when you feared I was close to the truth, you attempted to kill again. But you failed, madam. And now there is nowhere left to run. A heavy silence fell over the room. All eyes were on Madame Rosewood. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, she reached for her teacup once more. A fascinating theory, she murmured. But do you have proof? Poirot smiled. But of course, madam, he turned. Slightly. You see, there was one flaw in your deception. The real Lady Margaret had a habit, one so small, so insignificant, that it could have been overlooked entirely. But Mademoiselle Eleanor, she remembered. Eleanor's breath hitched. But she nodded. Poirot stepped forward. The real Lady Margaret always signed her letters a certain way. A slight embellishment, a flourish in her handwriting that you, madam, could never quite replicate. Madame Rosewood's grip tightened on her cup. Poirot's voice dropped. And we have those letters. Letters from before her supposed resurrection. Letters that prove you're not who you claim to be. A pause, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Madame Rosewood set her cup down. The room remained utterly still as she exhaled through her nose, a small, knowing smile playing at her lips. Well, well, she murmured. It seems you truly are as clever as they say, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot inclined his head. Merci, madam. Japp stepped forward then, his expression grim. You'll be coming with us, Madame Rosewood, if that's even your real name. She didn't resist. She merely rose to her feet, smoothing the fabric of her dress. A shame, she said lightly. I rather enjoyed playing the part. Poirot watched as the officers moved to restrain her, his sharp eyes noting the way. Her fingers curled ever so slightly, the last vestige of control slipping away. As they led her from the room, Eleanor let out a shaky breath beside him. It's over, she whispered. Poirot nodded, though his expression was pensive. Oui, mademoiselle. The crime is solved. He turned toward the window, gazing out at the darkened estate beyond. But the consequences, he murmured, have only just begun. As the heavy oak doors of the estate swung shut behind the officers escorting Madame Rosewood away, the weight of resolution settled over the room. Eleanor exhaled shakily, her fingers still trembling. Japp ran a hand over his mustache, letting out a satisfied grunt. Well, that's that, he muttered. A damned clever game she played, but she couldn't fool Poirot. Poirot did not respond immediately. He remained still, his gaze fixed on the delicate teacup Madame Rosewood had left behind. His fingers twitched, his mind racing. Something was wrong. The pieces fit, yet the picture they created did not feel quite complete. The certainty that had settled over the room, the sense of a case neatly solved, felt hollow. Too easy. Too clean, Poirot reached out, lifting the teacup with precise care. It was still warm. He turned it slightly, watching the thin line of liquid swirl at the bottom. A faint trace of red shimmered against the porcelain. His breath caught. Japp frowned. "What is it?" Poirot did not answer. He turned sharply, striding toward the door. "Stop them," he commanded. Now Japp blinked. "What?" Poirot's voice was sharp, urgent. "Stop the arrest. She is not the mastermind." The room exploded into movement. Japp barked orders as two constables rushed outside. Poirot followed swiftly, his shoes clicking against the marble as he descended. The steps, two at a time. The officers had barely reached the waiting car when Poirot arrived. Breathless, "Hold her." He snapped. The constables hesitated, startled by the sudden shift. Madame Rosewood, who had just been helped into the vehicle, tilted her head curiously. My, Monsieur Poirot," she said smoothly. "Having second thoughts?" Poirot ignored her. He turned to Japp. "She was too calm," he murmured. "She played her part, yes, but she played it knowing she was not truly trapped." Japp narrowed his eyes. "You said she had no way out." "I thought so," Poirot admitted. "But she knew something we did not." He turned abruptly, scanning the estate grounds. The night was still, the cold air biting. And yet his gaze landed on the carriage house. A dark figure moved just beyond the dim lantern glow. Poirot's pulse quickened. There, the figure hesitated for only a second before darting into the shadows. Poirot was already in motion. After them, the constables surged forward, boots pounding against the gravel as they pursued the fleeing shadow. Poirot followed, his mind clicking rapidly through the implications. If Madame Rosewood had never been the true mastermind, if she had merely been another piece in the game, then who had been holding the strings? The answer revealed itself the moment the figure stumbled into the light, a familiar face. A voice laced with quiet desperation. "Eleanor." She stood frozen, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her hands were stained with ink. No, not ink. Something darker. Something red. Poirot stopped short, his breath leaving him in a whisper. "Mon Dieu." Eleanor's lips parted. "I didn't mean." Poirot's heart ached, but his mind remained sharp. The pieces were finally falling into place, revealing a truth that had eluded him until now. The real mastermind had been hiding in plain sight. Eleanor stood in the pale glow of the lanterns, her breath uneven, her hands trembling at her sides. The crimson stain on her fingers was stark against her pale skin. Poirot studied her, his keen eyes searching for the truth in her expression. Japp reached for his revolver, but Poirot raised a hand. "Non, mon ami. This is not a woman who will run." Eleanor swallowed hard. Her voice broke. "I didn't want this." Poirot stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "But you orchestrated it." N'est-ce pas? "Every move, every deception, it was you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not deny it. Japp's expression hardened. "Explain." "Yourself, Miss Eleanor." She exhaled sharply, her composure slipping. "It was never supposed to go this far. I only wanted to scare him." To make him pay, Poirot nodded, his mind assembling the final pieces. Because he betrayed you, not just once, but over and over again. He took everything from you, Eleanor's. Breath hitched. He ruined my family, she whispered. My father trusted him, and he stole from us. And when my father tried to fight back, she broke off, shaking her head. You know how that ended. Poirot's voice was almost gentle. And so you waited. You planned. You found others with reasons to hate him, Madame Rosewood, the disgruntled employees, the silent victims who never spoke up. You let them believe they were in control, while all along you were the one pulling the strings. A tear slipped down her cheek. It should have ended with his fear. I never meant for him to die. Poirot tilted his head. And yet he did. Eleanor's lips trembled. Because someone else intervened. Someone who saw my plan and twisted it. Madame Rosewood, her voice turned bitter. She was never supposed to kill him. But she saw her chance and took it. Poirot nodded slowly. And you realized too late that your game had spiraled beyond your grasp. Eleanor's shoulders shook. I tried to cover the truth, destroyed evidence, misdirected suspicion, but I was always a step behind. And you, she let out a hollow laugh. You saw too much. Japp stepped forward, his cuffs ready. It's over, Miss Eleanor. You're coming with us, but Poirot's eyes remained locked on her face. There was something unresolved in her expression. Something dangerous, and then a flash of movement. A sudden burst of desperate energy. Eleanor turned, darting toward the carriage house. The constables lunged, but she was fast, her small frame slipping through their grasp. Poirot's heart pounded. Japp cursed. Stop her. She ran for the horses, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Poirot followed, his mind racing. If she reached the woods beyond the estate, she would be gone. But just as her fingers brushed the saddle, hands seized her wrists, she cried out, twisting, but the constables held firm. Japp arrived moments later, chest heaving. Enough of this. Eleanor sagged in their grip, her fight spent. Her gaze met Poirot's, something unreadable in her eyes. Poirot exhaled. It is finished, but even as he said it, he knew somewhere, deep inside, that this was not a clean victory. Justice had been served, but at what cost? As they led Eleanor away, Poirot turned back to the empty estate, the chill of the night seeping into his bones. The truth had been revealed, the mastermind unmasked. And yet, an unease lingered, because for all his skill, for all his precision, he had not foreseen the one thing that made the human heart so unpredictable: desperation. The morning fog curled around Poirot as he stood outside the manor, watching the last of the constables load Eleanor into the carriage. She didn't fight them any more. Her face was pale, drawn, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the trees. There was no triumph in her capture, no final outburst or bitter confession. Just silence. Japp exhaled beside him, adjusting his coat against the damp chill. A nasty business, but it's done now. Justice, as they say. Poirot didn't answer immediately. His fingers traced the silver edge of his pocket watch, but his mind was elsewhere. Japp frowned. "You don't look pleased, Poirot." "Thought you'd be gloating by now." Poirot shook his head. "Something does not sit right, mon ami," Japp scoffed. "Come on, we've got our culprit. Eleanor planned the whole thing set. The pieces in motion, used Madame Rosewood as her blade. It all fits." "Yes," Poirot murmured. "It fits. But does it fit perfectly?" Japp sighed, exasperated. "What are you getting at?" Poirot's gaze drifted toward the great stone house, its windows darkened, empty of the secrets they had once held. There had been a finality to Eleanor's capture, but not to the case itself. The truth had been revealed, yes. But was it the entire truth? He turned suddenly. "Japp, tell me, do you recall the broken watch?" Japp blinked. "What about it?" Poirot's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "It stopped at precisely 10:23 p.m., the supposed time of the murder. A convenient confirmation of our timeline, n'est-ce pas?" Japp nodded. So, Poirot said, stepping toward the house. "Who reset it?" Japp's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The watch was smashed when it hit the ground. If it had stopped upon impact, then the hands should have remained at the exact time of the fall." Poirot turned, his eyes sharp, but there was a 5-minute discrepancy. The true time of death was not 10:23, but earlier. Japp's expression darkened. "You think someone staged it?" "I do not think, mon ami. I know." A chill crept through the morning air, or perhaps it was only Poirot's realization settling in. Eleanor had orchestrated much, but she had not been alone in her deception. Someone else had moved in the shadows, adjusting the narrative, shifting the puzzle pieces into place, and that someone was still out there. Japp let out a heavy breath. "You mean to say we arrested the wrong person?" "No," Poirot said softly. "Eleanor was guilty. But she was not the only one." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of the unsolved question pressing down on them. The carriage. Wheels ground against the gravel as it carried Eleanor away, but Poirot's gaze remained on the house. Someone had been overlooked. The case was closed, and yet the mystery was far from over.